Hi, my name is Rudy Nieuwenhuis, and in this series of video tutorials, I'm going to try to show you the steps that I take to make a setup for animating a train or a roller coaster or something like that. Some yeah, train-like thing that's going to follow a curve. So I'm going to try to make this a little bit beginner friendly. I'm not going to do it very slowly, but I'm not going to introduce very complicated things neither. You can always pause and rewind if you didn't understand right away. I am going to assume a little bit of basic Houdini knowledge, so nothing overly complicated, so you don't have to be an expert. It's really beginner friendly, I hope. And I'm going to cut this into more than in multiple parts, so you can skip parts if you think those are too easy for me. I already know how to do this, and you can skip to the next part. And yeah, hope you can learn something. So let's start. I'm in Houdini here, and I'm doing this actually in 19.5. There, in a few weeks, 20 will be out, but there, I don't think anything will change to make this not work in Houdini 20, and hopefully it will work in 20.5 or 21 or whatever comes next. Um, as you can see, I got my setup a little bit different than the default build setup, because this is what most people have when they first start Houdini. I made a dual setup over here because that makes it easier for me to copy parameters and paste them over to something else without clicking in and out of networks over and over again. So let's start. The first thing that I'm going to need here is I'm going to make a geometry node, and in this geometry node I'm going to call this curve. And in this curve I am going to place a curve node, and by default it's set to a Bezier curve, which is of course possible, but I'm going to use a NURB curves because I like to draw in NURB curves. And I'm going to do this from the top viewport, so shift or not shift, sorry, spacebar 2 to look from the top. And I'm going to make a reasonably large curve over here because I want to work more or less real world scale. So I'm going to put down a couple of points to make something that might be slightly interesting. So let's say this is what I want. It's not extremely interesting, but it'll do for now. And I can of course change this and change this later on as well to make sure that the corners aren't too abrupt. But for now, why I'm drawing from the top viewport is because I want to have my track flat on the floor. So I don't want any elevation for now. We're going to add that later. But we start simple and we'll make it more and more complicated as we go along. So space 1 to look at it from another view. From perspective view, and this is actually all that's going to be in this curve. I'm gonna, for good measure, I'm gonna add a null over here, and this null, I'm gonna call this out, so it's easier to reference this later on from other pieces of geometry in the network. So what other pieces? Well, for example, here I'm going to make another geometry node, and I'm going to make the rails here. So I'm going to call this rails. And in the rails, I'm going to do an object merge. Oh, I have to type correctly, object merge. Here we go. And the object merge, I'm going to say curve. The out, no, because I did it all majuscule, all capital, sorry. I am having this one at the top, so it's easier to select. Got this in here, and here the transform, I'm going to say into this object. I do this because if, for example, this curve, I would have changed this here, so to translate or rotate it somewhere here, I want this transformation to come in here as well. For now, I just leave this at the origin and no rotation and anything, but yeah, just in case I want to change that later, then it is possible. So what I've got here is the curve, and if I'm showing the points, I just get the points of the NURB curve, but this is not going to be a problem for now, but a little bit later on we'll see. But first, what I'm going to do now is make a sweep node, and the sweep node has two inputs. One is the backbone curve and one is the cross section. And for a cross section, I'm going to use a line, and normally by default this line is set up in such a way, well, there is 0 minus 0 here, no idea, it should be 0. It's set up that it points in the upward direction, in the y direction, but if I sweep this like this, This is not something that looks like a rails or a track, so I'm gonna put this flat on the ground as well. So direction 1 in the X, 0 in the Y, and like this. Now this looks a little bit better. Next thing what I want to do, I'm gonna have a look, zoom in a little bit, and what I'm seeing already here is something that I don't like, is the fact that this is a little bit, jagged. It's not really very smooth over here, and that's the interpolation of the NURB curve that's not smooth enough for my liking. So what I'm gonna do here is I'm gonna use a resample and add a resample node in here. And now this is much better, because now every 10 centimeters I've got a line, and I can change this to every half a meter, for example. That's already more than enough. So, all right, that's the first step. But what I want to show you guys now is if my curve, this is the curve that's coming in, and the line that I'm putting sweeping over there, if I'm making the line bigger, it only goes to one side, if you can see. So I don't want this. I want this curve, my original curve, to be the center point of my rails. So to do that, my line, I'm going to say copy my parameter here, and I'm going to say I'm going to put it back a little bit, offset it by half, paste, well, I say copy parameters, and then I say paste a relative reference. And I'm going to say minus 0.5 times this one. And now, if we look correctly, we see that the original line is in the middle, and on either side of this line, if I make it bigger, it will go to either side. Here we go. Okido. So the next step is something a little bit odd, because I'm going to use an add node. And normally with the add node, you add stuff. But in this case, I'm not going to add stuff, I just want to delete stuff. And what do I want to delete? I want to delete all geometry except the points. So delete geometry, but keep the points. Strange to call it still an add node, but okay. And now I'm going to zoom into the beginning. Oh, this is the end. I'm going to go to the beginning of my curve, and I'm going to show you something interesting. And that is the point numbering of these points. We got 0, 2, 4, 6, 8, etc. and 1, 3, 5, 7. So all the evens are over here and all the odd ones are over there. And I'm going to use this to my advantage by adding another add node. But in this case, I'm not going to delete anything because or add some points or anything. I'm going to add some polygons, and I'm going to do this by group. And by group, I'm going to say skip every second point. So that means that it will make one polygon for this side of the track and one for this side of the track. And we can see that here. We got 2 polygons with in total 1032 points. All right, so this, I don't need to see those point numbers anymore. I don't need to see the points. This I can use again to put into a sweep node. And this sweep node is gonna have another input as the second input. And I'm gonna use a little grid over here. There's multiple things that you can use here, but I'm using a grid now, and the grid I'm going to make it a lot smaller than 10 by 10. I'm going to make it 10 centimeters wide, 5 centimeters high, and I'm going to reduce the rows and columns to 2. So if I'm going to zoom into this, what I've got here is something like this, but I'm going to use it in X, Y plane, because if I put this over here in the sweep, and I'm going to say Control G to zoom in on everything, or to show everything, I see that I now have the track on the floor laying around like this. Alright, so far I'm happy with this. But what's really strange is that this is blue, and that's because the normals are in the wrong direction. So if I say reverse the cross section, then my normals are in the right direction. And then there's still one more thing that I would like to do, which is not really necessary, but let's see where's the beginning here. If I look at the beginning, it's open. I don't like this open. I want to add some end caps here as a single polygon, and now on the beginning and on the end of the curve, here we go. These are closed. So this is the basic setup of my rails. So I've got my rails, I got my curve, got my rails. Okay, so next step is animate something over this curve. So for this I'm gonna make a, well, let's make another box. Let's make a box. I didn't make one yet, but let's make a box. And this box, for now, what I'm going to do, I'm going to use the constraints shelf over here, and over here there is follow path, and this one I'm going to use. First of all, I'm going to make sure that I've got my geometry that I want to have follow this curve, then I've got it selected. Then I'm going to click on the follow path, and what it's asking me now here in the bottom is select path object. Well, that's not very difficult because this is the path object, the one in the center that I want, my original curve, and enter to accept. Then it's going to ask me, is there any look at object? Well, I have no ID, so I'm going to say no. Well, I have an ID, but I know there is no one. But okay, I'm going to say no. There's nothing, and there is no look up object neither. So I'm going to say enter once more, and there we go. We see that our box snaps over here, and if I scroll through the timeline, we see that it goes all the way from the beginning to the end of the curve in the time of the animation that I've got here. How is this possible? Well, this is possible because in my geometry network here in the box, we see that there is the icon now that's time dependent. So if we go in here, we see that we have a constraint network, a chop network that has been created for us, and in this one we get world space, and then the magic happens here in the follow path chop node. The follow path chop node takes a look at the curve and then normalizes the distance of this curve and makes an expression for the position on this curve. And here, if you look, you see that this value is between roughly 0 and 1. So what's happening here is the $FF divided by $RF end. What this means is that it's looking at the floating frame, so the number of the frame as a floating point value, and it divides it by RF end, which is the total amount of the end frame of your animation. So it's also the total amount of frames that you've got in your animation. Well, this is very interesting if you would want to use this, but this is not what I want to use because I want to have some control over this on a higher level, and I don't want this normalized distance. I want this different. But first, let's make sure that we've got something that can control this. Well, if I want to control this box, I could of course go in here, go into here, and go here and animate here, something like this. But yeah, this is not really very handy. I want to be able to control my train, the position of my whole train, or my roller coaster, or whatever it is that I'm making. I want to control it on one position for every single wagon here. I don't want to do this per wagon or per whatever. So instead of making something here that controls it, I could of course make an extra empty master control null or something where I put this on, but I'm not going to do that. I'm going to make a subnet out of this in which there can be multiple wagons and everything. So I'm going to do this by clicking Shift C when I've got this selected, and now I've got a subnet. And in this subnet, well, first of all, I'm going to call this subnet train, and then in this subnet, now I've got my box, and still everything is working as it was before. But the nice thing about this is now that here on this train, I will be able to make my own parameters over here. So how am I going to do this? I'm going to click on this little cogwheel and say Edit Parameters Interface. And I get this window where, if you look correctly, you see that here is a transform folder and a subnet folder. And those are transform and subnet. And I'm going to just minimize these, and I'm going to add my own because I'm going to put it on top. So it gets in front. And I'm going to call this train settings. Train settings. Oh. Train settings, the name of this I don't care, so apply, and as you can see now we've got our own little space to make settings for our train. And the first thing that I'm going to make here is my own floating value, and this float value I'm going to call this the position on the track. So position on track. Okay, and here I'm going to call this pos on track. You see that I'm camel casing. It's you start with a small letter, and every new word I put in a capital, so it's easier for me to distinguish between parameter names or labels. I'm going to say apply and position on track. Well, for now, this is a value with a slider that goes between 0 and 10. That's because here, this range, I haven't defined this yet, but it defaults from 0 to 10. But I want to change this a little bit later on to the distance of my curve. Because, as I'm going to show you now, if I were to copy this parameter and go into my train, into my box, into my constraint, on the path, and instead of this expression, I'm going to say delete channels, so right mouse delete channels, and then right mouse paste relative reference. I now have the value that I've got here, position on track, deciding where on the track my box should be. But if you look correctly, then I see here, once it goes beyond 1, up it loops and goes back to the beginning. And this is not something that I want, because this is a little bit more difficult to control, and I want absolute control over what's happening here. So instead of using the normalized distance, I'm going to say distance from start. And now, if I'm going to put this something close, then up it goes up, 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 and when it's at 10, it actually traveled 10 meters now. But I want to know how many meters it will be for my entire track. In this case, it's about, well, 257 or something like that. So what I'm going to do is go back to this one, say edit parameters interface. Oh, I still had it open here. So this is my values here. So I'm going to say the maximum value is 257, and I'm going to say apply. So now apply, yes. So now if I can see, okay, I cannot go beyond 257. But there's one little thing that is bothering me a lot, and that's the fact that if I go back all the way to 0, it'll snap to the end of the curve instead of the beginning. And for one reason or another, and I have to be honest, no clue actually why I have a clue, but I think this should not happen, is that this value, when you put it on 0, it snaps back to here, because it abbreviates something or it rounds something that makes it go there. So I don't want this. I want this to be 0.5, for example, as the minimum. So I'm going to put this at 0.5 as the minimum, apply, so it can never go lower than that. So now at 0.5 it stays here, and okay, all the way to the end it's over there. Voila. So that's actually part 1. I'm going to leave it at this for now. I'm going to save the file, and yeah, I'll see you in part 2 where we continue.